I'd like to thank the Committee of 100 and Mike Kelly, and also David Marshall for supplying some postcard images for me. This is going to be mostly focused on the Palisades, but I need to put a little bit into the context of it. I just love this postcard, the two oceans kissing together at the Panama Canal. France began work in 1881, but because of engineering problems and a high worker mortality, the United States took over the project in 1904 and opened the canal on August 15th in 1914. One of the exhibits, but not visited very much, was actually a wonderful grand reproduction of the Isthmus of Panama embracing the canal zone. However, not many visitors well understood what it was. They usually walked past it, and most fairgoers wanted the pizzazz and to be entertained. And as most of you know, San Diego had to overcome many struggles to bring the fair to fruition, including competition with New Orleans, San Francisco, each intending to host similar expositions. We talked about good hue and stuff, but rather than to do the default styles at that time, which was the Beaux-Arts, the classic Greek or Roman, which Chicago's famed White City and San Francisco's competing exposition used, Goodhue designed to do the Spanish colonial revival style. So we have then the opening day next. And then as years went by, George Marsh in 1922, in a letter to the San Diego Union said, "I've been asked, why should the buildings be saved? Our community has grown slowly with conviction that what we have there in the park, which is something more than just the buildings, must not perish. We are instinctively, unconsciously, and incurably in love with them, and we will not give them up." During this time, the California Highway Commission in 23 supported the passage of the state's first gas tax of 2 cents per gallon. Don't we wish we could go back to that? To take full responsibility for design constructions, roadways, and bridges. And by 26, the interstate system was linked, including State Route 1 and Route 66, and the WPA projects were on their way. We are also, unfortunately, starting to move into the Great Depression. So it was decided that travel and transportation would be the main theme of the 1935 California Pacific Expo. And I love this matchbox. This is a matchbox. You notice the modern aircraft that are in the skies there. At this point in time, San Diego had become the air capital of the U.S. with the first airline services by Ryan in the late 20s from San Diego to Los Angeles. And we also saved it for another year, both in 35 and 36. And it was really promoted to cure San Diego's post-depression ills. Richard Requa oversaw many of the designs of the new buildings. And the night lighting was really great. And by the way, this place doesn't have any Wi-Fi. That should be the first thing that the city does, is put Wi-Fi in all these buildings. It costs nothing. Anyway, go on YouTube. David and his compadres have put together a wonderful video with music showing all the light time uses of the 1935 exposition. You can also find movie editors on YouTube, but I can't show it here. So night lighting in 35 was much different than 1915. And in order to highlight deep relief and stuff, H.O. Davis supervised the lighting in 1935. He gave Maxfield Parrish, a painter of fantasy images and luminous, bold colors, as his inspiration. And rather than directing the lights on buildings, which was in the Palisades had plain walls, and on the El Prado the walls were encrusted with ornament, he directed the lights to be skybound. Just imagine yourself, and I'm sure the pilots will have some concern coming into Lindbergh, but imagine yourself at a park like this with all of these great lights shooting in all the buildings like this. So in the middle of this depression, the Palisades architecture became a very eclectic mix. And the major buildings themselves seem to be Art Deco, but they have a lot of different styles and feelings on them. The fair's most popular attractions were the Ford Building and the Midway. And visitors from the Chamber of Commerce were sort of discouraged from staying and seeking employment. In fact, the Chamber said, "Come to California for a glorious vacation. Advise anyone not to come seeking employment lest he be disappointed. But for the tourists, attractions are unlimited." This was also the period in which we were in our mid-century Art Deco feeling of what was going to be modern. This was a design by art director Juan Larranaga that we talked about before. But it's kind of interesting. You notice how clean and modern it looks, very Art Deco-ish. Well, it was never built, and instead, this was the Midway, which is the amusement zone, which of course, for both of the amusement zones were where the parking lot for the San Diego Zoo is. But it was interesting that these attractions and stuff that we showed before then somehow got captivated in this feeling. So Requa started to put a Moorish style arc in the future in the middle of the plaza, not this plaza, but up near the House of Hospitality. And the upper deck housed floodlights to address and being operated by the Associated Oil Company. He placed low lights and pools on the north and south sides and considered these to be really an addition. And now, of course, that's where the small fountain is now located in there. And then there was other things that were done to the buildings. This happened to be the Foreign Arts Building, showing the carved furniture and ivories and silken fabrics, as Japan was the first foreign nation to embrace the exposition. You notice it's kind of a barn interior. And I want to say almost from the same spot. Rico put a big hole in the building, ripped off one of the extensions out over so he could put some of the gardens from the Morrill Gardens down there. So there was a lot of the different buildings that were happening besides just what we tend to think of 1935s just being down here in the Palisades. So I thought this is a rather interesting photograph. We're going to come back to it with the same photo that Mike showed here. But this was the Plaza de America right now, which has all your cars parked in it. But you'll notice as you're looking all the way down towards the end, the Standard Oil Company building in the background, you can see it's taken from the Ford building, from the round circle that you see from the shadow on there. But you'll notice that the far end is a little bit different. The fountains are still there, but the ends are a little bit different. And then the Standard Oil building. Now, it was unique that a lot of these folks, when they're looking at mixing this design, they were inspired by prehistoric palaces in Mexico and the Yucatan. And in their souvenir program, Standard Oil modestly states, particularly notable within the building is a lack of commercialism, the whole of the exhibit being devoted to the story of the national parks of the West. Travel to these great national parks recently set up by Teddy Roosevelt. So you find now, even though the thing is transportation and industry, and you're bringing in these major things, they do have a sensitivity. Okay, we're not going to linger too much on this, but down towards the bottom now, or where all the state and county buildings were placed. And all of these, almost all of these buildings are gone, except for the one that's sort of in the center over to the left. And this is the building we're in now, which was brought to New Mexico. So this is pretty much what we have today. Most of you have walked this, so you know this pretty well. All right, the Santa Fe Railroad sponsored a Painter Desert. This seemed to be a fascination that really kind of led to not only this building being saved, but also being redone as well. There seemed to be exhibits that were the larger tribes, including the Apache and the Navajo, really were looking at. This, unfortunately, was torn down, I think, sometime in the 40s. Next. However, the building that we're in was first constructed, again, for the 1915 Panama, California, for New Mexico exhibits. It's interesting that when this was first done, Bertrand Goodhue, who really wanted to do more of the Spanish Revival or Spanish Baroque buildings, he really felt that this has a place in itself. However, it was Isaac Rapp who established really this Pueblo Revival style in the architecture idiom of New Mexico. And in fact, even architects in New Mexico now sort of call this the Santa Fe style, although it's not to me a Santa Fe style, it's more of a Pueblo revival. But it was one of the more popular buildings and actually stayed. And of course, the wonderful fountain and the murals that we have out in the foyer. And I'm really happy that all that was restored. So it's interesting that if Rico would have appreciated the style that was then flourishing in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, he didn't really show it very much when he transformed the 1915 building that we're in. Acting on a request from the California Department of Education, he spanned the patio with a roof, thus destroying the indispensable southwestern trait and dramatic views of the second level. But one of the more favored exhibits was by the California Institute of Technology. And remember, this is in the 1930s. It included a powerful X-ray tube, studies of heredity, examinations on the causes of earthquakes, a working model for the Boulder Dam electric transmission, a model of the Palomar Observatory. So it was rather interesting that we're still keeping the theme of it, but the architecture is rather eclectic for the Southwest. The Palace of Electricity and Varied Industries. This was kind of unique in the sense that it has the Mayan-style ornamentation and a very large in-ground artwork at the entryway. The advertisement, though, was unique in terms of the Palace of Electricity, the House of Magic, as they called it, where you had a display of electricity marvels sponsored by General Electric. It's kind of unique when you're really thinking that what was happening in 1935 could still be around today. And we still have remnants that are here, the colored concrete, which I think is in fairly good, strong condition. It just needs to be cleaned. And out in front of the San Diego Automotive Museum, of course, was this 20-foot by 120-foot thing that contained the jets of the water and the spray and everything else. In today's things, it's kind of difficult to have fountains that's like that. Roger and I were just talking about this earlier. I saw a fountain, I think it was in Philadelphia, that actually used fiber optic cables with a large fan and thing, and when you're looking at it from about 50 feet, it kind of looks like water, but it's not. It looks like a spray, which is kind of unique. But certainly on special occasions, this is really, really a thing. We've heard about losing 280 parking spaces, and we understand that. I have some suggestions towards the end of this from other historic sites and a quote from Rod Roberts, and we'll catch up with that. The federal building built to house exhibits of the United States government, again in sort of an off-Mayan motif. And it's modeled after the doorway of the Governor's Palace in Oxnard, Yucatan. So it's interesting that even when this was restored in 2000, there was talk about restoring the colorful murals that Mike had mentioned, but it simply wasn't recreated. Now these buildings that we have here are really in pretty doggone good condition. They weren't like the House of Hospitality and the other ones where it was staff plaster and only 70% of the ornamentation was there and it was falling. In fact, I have a picture. David wanted to put it on the little postcard he's sending around to everybody that shows me back in the 90s grabbing one of the spearheads on the south entry, I think, to the House of Hospitality. It was the only thing that was left there. I didn't want to show it because that was 40 years later and I was 40 years thinner at that point. So. But anyway, these buildings are really in good condition. And I remember in school, an architect by the name of Craig Elwood came and talked to us. And he said two things. He said, in order to be a successful architect, make sure that all of your buildings are built out of concrete, like, for instance, the federal building, which is poured-in-place concrete, because people will have a hard time tearing them down. They'll simply do an adaptive reuse of them. And then make sure that you married a rich woman so that you can build your own designs. Neither of that happened to me. Of course, he was married to the mother that played the mother Dennis the Menace on TV. So, but these are really in good buildings. And the details have held up really nicely. And again, you can see the glass where the mural belongs. Again, Mayan priest doing whatever Mayan priests do at that time. And I'm hoping that that Comic-Con will perhaps add some to this. I'm really not sure exactly where that lease agreement is right now. Next. And then to me, really kind of the queen of the park. I mean, this is where everybody used to get together. It was the Starlight Civic Light Opera. And I remember Ron Roberts once saying, you know, he graduated from high school in this bowl. And he said there's probably a seat with my initials carved in it some way. And I said, Ron, don't say that. Those are, you know, historic seats or whatever. Everybody's going to want to put their name in there. It's unfortunately that they had to file for bankruptcy in 2011, walking away with costumes still hanging in the rooms. But like everything in the park, there's always a hero or heroes or heroines that come along. And Save Starlight, again, the nonprofit, recently signed a city special use permit to start to reactivate the upper portion of the property. So I think that these are really good. I mean, can you imagine? I was there several times watching performances and stuff. You know, it was kind of funny when you're first there, but after you get there a while, even with the planes going over and with part of their stuff with their quieter home programs and everything else, I think this would be wonderful. Here's a performance that was on July 20th in 1935 that was sponsored by Standard Oil in what was used to be called the Ford Bowl rather than the Starlight Bowl. And we know it's going to cost some money, but the leaders that we have now in San Diego, I think, are looking at where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck. And to have people come here and enjoy a space like this is really tremendous. Okay, so the last one we're going to talk about is the Ford Tower that you see a picture of here. And this was going to be, again, the Ford Museum for the Transportation. This was the initial design, wasn't ever built. You can see how big it was. And the reason why it was that big is because it wanted to counterbalance the Standard Oil building that was down at the other end of the park. You know, I'm going to be taller than you. So this looks similar, but not quite the same. This was originally built as the centerpiece of the Ford's display at the Chicago World's Fair in 1934, 1 year before our fair. 12 stories tall, it's designed by Albert Kong, a well-known architect for the time. And again, it's meant to represent a concentric set of gears. So at the close of the fair, which is rather interesting, instead of the buildings coming down, Henry Ford had it dismantled and shipped to Dearborn and then reassembled. They wanted to kind of enclose the rotunda, so they hired Buckminster Fuller to design a dome. And during the time, and you can kind of see the little inset picture to the lower left, it caught fire and burned down, which was unfortunate. Next. I apologize for the quality of the slide here. They basically built this building in 88 days, the Ford building. Wouldn't it be great in today's political world that we can get something done? I mean, Sandy, how long does it take to just get your little electric cars going? I mean, really. 3 shifts, 8 hours each. Completely synchronated. Next. And it was industrial designer Walter Teague who used Kahn's design for the Century of Progress Ford building and the General Motors building as sources as he put together the one here in Balboa Park. Again, it looks like a gear wheel laid down on its side and a gear symbolism and everything else. And by the way, Teague was a designer of cameras, flat irons, and radios. He wasn't an architect, but he could really design something. The Ford Flathead V8, and I actually had one a long time ago, was introduced in 1932. I was not quite around at that time, but it was 3 years before the expo, and they really wanted to sell it. So the fountain that is probably hard to perceive when you're actually in the building itself is there. And then the great little light fixtures are are exhaust and intake valves from an engine shaped like that, stacked on one another. And it became, the one thing about the Ford V8, when you talk about culture, it was a cultural phenomenon that really started the hot rod. When we did the cover of the building, I was wanting to make sure that we didn't lose this, because if the planes are in the right position, you can actually see this. So my suggestion was that we go ahead and we use the Ford blue and we put it on the cover that's up there. And when you do fly over, you'll see that Ford V8 as you're coming in, and that's why we pulled it up. And again, the transportation murals on the inside wall, not the outside, which was really incredible, because it started from caveman carving out logs for canoes, and actually had a Buck Rogers scene at the end with space travel. That was done, and I think David has probably collected by now everything that was sold in this Ford museum, I'm sure. And one of the things was you could get in a car and you could drive around, called the Roads of the Pacific, or the Roads of Tomorrow, which was a ramp that went around, which was incorporated actually into the New York's World Fair in 1939 as well. Of course, we had the Cabrillo Freeway pretty much passing through that. But I think it's interesting that when the folks that started to do this canyon landscape that came in, it was Milton Sessions, nephew of Kate Sessions, who planted rubber and pepper trees and ferns and all of that sort of stuff, so that you could actually drive through a desert and drive through trees and everything else. So it was pretty cool. You'll notice there's a couple of these big obelisk types of things confronting. This was the later edition of the place where all of our cars are parked now. So just keep an eye on those for a second. Next. And then at night, which was great, with all the lighting and everything else, the Ford had unusual lights on it. It really illuminated the blue color of the Ford, and of course with that, so you could really see it well. All right, so like the first exposition, the 35 Fair, not only going on for a second year, but when it began, and this is what we need to do, is order to make sure that we get our legislators and our Congress members involved in this, because the opening ceremonies for the second season began when President Franklin D. Roosevelt pressed a gold telegraph key in the White House to turn on the exposition's lights. Now, isn't that cool? So when we're going to celebrate this in about another, 16, 17 years, whoever the president is, I don't think it'll be Donald Trump, but whoever it's going to be, let's see if we can't deal on a much larger and broader scale. When the final numbers were tallied, the 35-36 event counted 6.7 million people, almost double the amount of people that came here in 1915 in the height of a depression. Probably the most successful thing that's happening. Mike already did a pitch, and thank you, Mike, for showing that there. My wife, Lori, was supposed to be with me today, but she couldn't make it. And if she ever finds out that I bought all 9 tiles of that airplane, she's going to kill me. So, but I put it on yours. Let's do this. This is great. And if it's even anything like the mock-ups that we have there, it's great. And Mike, thanks for sharing with board members as we're going through the design process, so we have a chance to add our 2 cents for whatever they're worth here. It's, I think, because of this dynamic and picturesque frescoes and everything else that we have in front of the transportation, the California State, the electricity building, and all of this, even though they merited more of a designation of an Art Deco, it also then captures a lot of the other things that's so important to us. The decorative moldings, part of the reliefs and stuff, flowering vines hanging from the roofs. And I saw the little news clip that you guys did, and they're not ugly buildings. They're simply like all of us when we get old. We just need to have our teeth brushed a little bit harder, and our eyes, cataracts removed, and hair transplants if you really want to go that far. But we just need to fix ourselves up on this. So I think it's important. Next. Okay, so here's my pitch. This is the last slide. This is a slide that Mike showed you, again, from the top of the Air and Space Museum. So I just went online and I just kind of Googled and I said, well, how many historic sites or parks, and how do they deal with parking? And you would be astounded to see how many of these, as Rod Roberts said, he said once regarding when we finished the historic county administration building, and I was talking with him and I said, okay, so I won on the color. You didn't get your white, but we got the historic color. But I said, isn't there something we can do with the cars? And he says, oh, it's just too expensive. Would be nice if we could put them underground or anything else. And then he said, you know what? We need to put those cars underground. And now when you're down by the Embarcadero, how nice that is. Isn't that just great? And that's the vision that we need from our civic leaders in order to look at what the cost benefits would be. So I looked at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Director Park in Portland. I was in Zurich 2 years ago, which all their major parks and commons were put underground. And, you know, if we're going to restore this to somewhat what it looked like, we'd have a great entry as we're coming in. We're in a depressed area over there. All we got to do is just kind of scoop out a little bit, go down. Instead of just losing 280, we'll gain 3 times that. We do it downtown with our high rises. We do it all the time. So if we're going to do it, rather than going through the expense of putting in the fountains and the landscaping and all that and saying, oh my God, we missed an opportunity, we should have studied it more, let's study it now. Parking is still going to be a problem, no matter what we do in the park. But this gives us an incredible opportunity to put 3 layers of parking underground. And when I was in Zurich, it was really cool because the elevators would take you up to stores and everything from the parking. You weren't going and walking upstairs and all that. You say, okay, they don't have Macy's, but I say, okay, you want to go shop in Macy's, here's the elevator to Macy's. And we have those 2 big old things sticking there that can be part of our exhausting air, you know, because we're going to have to change the air in there because it's going to be enclosed just like a high rise. So lots of good opportunities. And I know that the Committee of 100 can make this work. So I congratulate you all for keeping the vision alive, celebrating your 51st year. It's amazing. And I'll just leave you with one thought. As most of you know, Robert Miles Parker passed away a few years ago. And Robert and I became very good friends over the years. I was actually at his house when he was talking about preserving it and trying to make it a historic district, and this was way back in, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s. And he, when we're doing the House of Hospitality, I wanted him to do a sketch like he normally does. And then he usually writes a poem or a quote, and Mike has a copy of this without the quote. And so anyway, he did a wonderful sketch of the House Hospitality. These were nice large boards, and down below he said, when one hears the bells toll in Balboa Park, it reminds you of B. Evanson and the Committee of 100. Now, that's pretty cool. I don't know what happened during that time, but those signs were up and somebody came along and scratched off that quote. So when I'm dead and buried, you'll get the original, but right now you got a copy. So. But I think that's, again, going back to George Martian's quote in 1922, or his letter to the San Diego Union, this place captivates us. We can't let it go. We're standing on shoulders of people that came before us, and the people that come after us will stand on our shoulders as long as we don't stoop and we stand upright and make sure that we get really good civic leadership that we've had in the past for Balboa Park. So thank you very much.